Well, good morning, everyone. Again, welcome to our lunch tables. It's great to have you here today as we have our special guest, Chase Cotton. He's going to be sharing an overview of youth mental health, something that's so vitally important today as we are still experiencing post-COVID and just so many different social and emotional challenges in our communities. What a great topic to be able to become well versed on and to get educated on and to have some resources in our back pocket. So today we have Chase with us, and he is the community director at the Willow Center of Mental Health Counseling and Substance Abuse Treatment Center in Brownburg, Indiana. So we are grateful to have him here today. I did put his bio in the chat box there, and of course you have already received that as well through our e-blast that we've sent out. So without further ado, like to say thanks to all of you for being here, and thanks to Chase for being here. And a couple more housekeeping things is that Chase is going to do his presentation, and then right after that we'll take a few moments to pause and just kind of take a break, and we'll come back for small groups, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A at that point. So again, just looking forward to the topic, looking forward to spending this morning with you all and learning about this great topic of youth mental health. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Chase to our forum today. Welcome, Chase.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. It is a pleasure to spend time with you. Let me go ahead and share my screen, get the PowerPoint pulled up, and we'll dive it in. All right, everybody seeing that okay? Somebody can give me an audible yes or no.
I just see a black screen.
It says has started sharing screen, but nothing's there yet.
Well, let's try it again. All right, how about now?
Perfect.
All right, let's rock and roll. So I'll tell you more about the Willow Center later, but for now, I want to go ahead and dive into this content. A few learning objectives to start with. One, I want to help you to become more aware of the prevalence and data regarding youth substance use and mental health struggles. Two, I want to help us discover the root causes of substance use and mental health struggles, including but not limited to adverse childhood experiences and social determinants of health. And three, I want to help you gain practical tools and recommendations that you can use in your daily work with young clients in particular. So first we need to start with some definitions, just set some foundation for us to build upon. What is mental health in general? Mental health has a lot to do with your emotions and the way you feel, has a lot to do with your judgment and decision-making skills, and it has a lot to do with our relationships, the way we interact with one another. In other words, it's kind of the thing behind all the other things. So even if we aren't talking about our experience of mental health in specificity, it's influencing what we're doing and how we're acting and how we're interacting regardless. So it's an everyday part of life, even though it's been sort of shuffled to the side for many, many years. Thankfully, that taboo and that stigma is changing, at least in the past couple of decades. Another great metaphor for mental health that I like is the spectrum model. So the exterior oval you see, the dotted line, represents like all of the trauma or stress or painful experiences that we might go through in our life. And we're all going to have those things, right? To varying degrees of severity. And because of those external experiences, we were going to experience something internal as well, which is what the spectrum represents. And all of us are going to experience multiple points of that spectrum. Some will experience more points of illness. Some will experience more points of wellness. But what's most important to understand about the spectrum is that it's connected in the middle, right? So it's not the mentally ill over here and the mentally well over here. It's just us. And that's a really, really important place to start from, because already it humanizes the discussion as opposed to talking about us and them or those people. It's just us. Once we experience some of those stressors or some of those symptoms of illness, we're ultimately going to cope with it. And all of us have different levels of coping skills and coping strategies we're going to use. We'll talk about some of those, both healthy and unhealthy, later.
Hey, Chase, have you started your PowerPoint yet? Gone through the slides yet?
Yes. Is it not going?
The only screen that we see is still the Willow Center. I don't know if you need to hit preview.
For goodness sakes, guys, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Hey, it's all good.
try it one more time.
Okay,
Okay.
there we go.
See those advancing now?
Yes, it's advancing. Perfect. Thank you.
Golly, I'll bet that was really annoying for you guys, just looking at the same thing and hearing me talk for ever and ever. Thank you for speaking up. That's the emotions, the judgment, the interpersonal skills, etc. Here's the spectrum model that I was discussing just a moment ago. And so, spectrum of illness to wellness, we're all going to experience that at multiple points throughout our life. Remember, it's just us. It's connected in the middle, right? There is no us and them. There is no the mentally ill. It's just us experiencing symptoms, oftentimes influenced by the variety of stress or painful experiences that we might go through in our life. So let's go ahead and define some of the primary symptoms of mental health struggles, just so you can be aware for your own good, as well as for the young clients that you might be working with, what to look for, what warning signs to look for. Feeling very sad or withdrawn for extended periods of time, with or without reason. Fatigue and unmotivation, and this is more than just the normal, oh, I don't want to go to work today, or I don't want to get out of bed for school. This is like all day fatigue, like your feet feel heavy. It's just difficult to get through daily life. Self-harming thoughts or plans, any sort of risk-taking behavior, especially if it's unusual for that client. Overwhelm and fear, often that comes with like those physical discomforts of like racing heartbeat and shortness of breath, things like that. Significant changes in eating habits and or weight. This could be too much or not enough. This could be weight gain or weight loss. Severe mood swings. It can be pretty even keel one day and then really bummed out the next, and then really high the next day. Or sometimes this can happen in the course of a few hours. Substance use obviously is a symptom. Drastic changes in behavioral or personality. Again, anything that's out of the normal for this student or this client. Changes in sleeping habits. Difficulty concentrating at school or work, intense worries that interfere with daily activities. All of those are very common symptoms of mental health struggles, with or without diagnosis, right? And maybe you can identify a few of those that you felt yourself, that you've experienced yourself, and that's very common. We'll talk about the commonality of that from a data perspective here in a few slides. It's also important to be aware of what symptoms and signs to look for when it comes to substance use. So although we label substance use a symptom of a mental health struggle because they are directly linked, there are also some very specific things that you'd want to look for if your students or your clients might be using a substance. Irritability and defensiveness, paranoia, feeling like somebody might be after me or somebody's always watching me, dishonesty or theft, rationalizing or diversion, like, oh, it's not a problem. No, I'm fine. Everything's okay. I've got this under control. Rationalizing like that. Isolation and intentional separation from loved ones is a huge red flag. Mood swings, again, shows up here. Promise making and breaking, like this is the last time I drink, I promise. I promise this is the last time I'm going to that friend's house this weekend. I won't go ever again after this. Just one last party. Missing important events, work, school, etc. Sleep problems, could be sleeping too much or not able to sleep at all. Financial difficulties, because there's no such thing as a free substance use problem, right? It costs a lot of money to upkeep that. And there's also some paraphernalia type signs that you want to be aware of. You might see things like rolled dollar bills, which can be used as a pipe, either to smoke or snort something. You might find crumpled up or used or stained aluminum foil, which is used as like a tray for heating element. Lighters, of course. Any sort of powder or wax is suspect. Pills, obviously, you want to be aware of. What you see there, those sort of candy-colored pills are actually lab-manufactured fentanyl pills. Spoons, again, you might see that characteristic discoloration from being used as a heating element. Bongs are obvious. Any sort of hypodermic or needles or sharps. Things that look like postage stamps. That could be a stamp that is, or a piece of paper that is used for acid or LSD. Sometimes Molly is used that way as well. You might notice unusual odors. This could be sweet, sour, putrid, smoky, anything that's out of the ordinary. Bottles, cans, disposable cups, etc., that wouldn't normally be there if it's just accumulating, things like that. Vape pens or vape cartridges. All of these things are paraphernalia you'd want to be aware of. That it's not normal. There's something wrong happening here that we want to be focusing on. I want to zoom in on pills just for a moment. Okay, so here's a few pictures of pills. Some of those are legal pills that could be prescribed. Some of those are illegal pills. Does anybody recognize any of those? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself
Fentanyl?
Yeah, so I showed you the fentanyl one, right? You guys know what the blue bar is? It would be 707. That would be pretty typical of Xanax, right? You see Percocet represented here, Vicodin. Right, so a lot of these are photos of either manufactured, like lab manufactured, or prescribed opioid painkillers, or psychoactive medication, things for like depression, anxiety, etc. Okay, so there's some of the most common names there listed for you. I won't read through all of those for you, but it's all names that we're pretty familiar with at this point. But a lot of times they have slang names for them associated with them as well, or shortened names that you might want to be aware of, like Perk, Oxys, Xannies, Molly, etc. It's estimated that as much as 80 to 85% of illegally sold and illegally purchased powders, waxes, or pills are laced with potent and often deadly synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Okay. So even though not every pill might have it, most do. And the fact of the matter is, when somebody is purchasing something illegally, they're not necessarily trying to die, right? They might be purchasing something to stave off withdrawal symptoms. Maybe they're searching for a high, depending on the severity of their addiction. But they're certainly not trying to be poisoned to death, right? And that's really tragic, right? Because they don't always know what they're purchasing. In particular, when it comes to young people, they might think they're purchasing a Xanax from a friend, but that's probably at least 85% likely that's a Xanax laced with fentanyl, okay, which can kill you. Just to put it in perspective, on the left-hand side, you see a lethal dose of heroin. On the right-hand side is a lethal dose of fentanyl. So it looks like, like a few granules of salt. Like, it doesn't take a lot to put a human down. And that's because opioid painkillers, and oftentimes some of these psychoactive medications as well, affect the areas of our brain responsible for breathing and heart rate, which are both really important for being alive, right? So it slows those things down, those two functions down, and if you get too much of it in your system, it can stop those functions altogether, and that is what ends up killing a lot of individuals, unfortunately. But most folks are not just starting with something like fentanyl or an opioid laced with fentanyl, right? Most folks, especially young folks, are starting with something else. So we need to talk about gateways. The three most frequent first-use substances for students and young people are alcohol, vaping, and cannabis, and that could be in any form. Those who use the following substances, if you get drunk regularly or you misuse alcohol, you're 2 times more likely to try a harder substance later in life. If you misuse marijuana or cannabis, you're 3 times more likely to try a harder substance. If you misuse cocaine, you're 15 times more likely to use a harder substance. And if you misuse pain pills, you're 40 times more likely to try a harder substance. So there are gateways, right? I know that could be kind of a buzzword that some of us would rather forget from like the DARE education days back in middle school, but frankly, it's true. It's just statistically true. Most students are starting with the more socially acceptable or softer substances like alcohol, tobacco, vaping, cannabis, etc., and eventually graduating on towards harder substances because of the way addiction affects the brain. And we'll dive into the brain in a moment. But before we do that, it's important to understand, why are some kids struggling? Why are there higher incidences right now of mental illness among young people in Indiana? Why are there higher rates of substance use among young people in Indiana? In order to illustrate sort of the reason behind this, I have to tell you a story. Okay, it's a story about frogs. So once upon a time, there was a young man who was a college student at the University of Chicago, and he was majoring in biology. And as one of his senior final projects, he had to go do some field observation and sort of write a paper about what he observes based on what species and environment and all that jazz. And so he decides he's going to go to the pond that's in the horticulture park near campus, and he's going to look at the wildlife in the pond and write down what he observes, etc., see if he knows any patterns. And this pond is particularly famous for having a lot of frogs. Okay, so notices that there are about 500 frogs or so. All right, and out of those 500 frogs, most of them are ribbiting fine. They've look pretty normal. They're just hanging out on lily pads and rocks like frogs do. But he finds this one frog that is ribbiting backwards. All right, this frog is going tibber, tibber, tibber. That's unusual, right? He'd never seen this before, so he writes that down. But he's not sure like what to do about it, or like what his thesis is going to be. So he decides, how about I go to my professor and I tell my professor what I found. So his professor reads the student's notes, and the professor tells the young man, okay, that's interesting, but you need to learn more about what's happening to this frog. What's going on? You need to go ahead and go back to that pond next week, all right, and see if you notice any differences with that frog. So the student returns to the pond the following week, and this time, instead of just one frog ribbiting backwards, there's like 25 frogs ribbiting backwards. I was like, this is strange. Right now we got a whole bunch of frogs tiburing instead of ribbiting. This is unusual. Like, what's wrong with these frogs? There's clearly something wrong with the frogs. They must have a disease. They, I don't know, maybe it's because of the lily pads they chose, or maybe it's because their feet are webbed a little differently than the others or something. I don't know. I need to get a closer look at these frogs. There's something wrong with the frog. So he writes those notes down, goes back to his professor, says, here's what I saw. It seems to be spreading. I don't know what's up. Professor says, all right, go back in another 2 weeks and see what's happening. But this time I want you to lift your head. All right, don't just stare at the pond and the frogs. Like, look around. So the student goes back, and when he arrives 2 weeks later, all 500 frogs are tiburing instead of ribbiting. I was like, there's something up here, right? There's got to be more to this story. It's not just the frogs. And so he follows his professor's advice. He starts looking around behind the boundaries of the horticulture park's entrance, and he sees a new housing development going up over there. And you can see off in the distance, about maybe half a mile away, there's a factory just billowing smoke into the air. And then he notices upstream, there's a little stream that feeds this pond, that there's a drainage pipe. And out of that drainage pipe is coming just the nastiest sludge you've ever seen. And it smells, it stinks. This is not normal, just like sewage. Like, this is coming from somewhere, and it's directly feeding into this pond. And so the student's like, I think I know what's happening to these frogs, right? It wasn't something that was wrong with the frogs, right? It's something that's happening to the frog's environment, right? There's something wrong with the pond. Right, so that's where the place for prevention starts coming into play. Right, something you hear said, especially in the public health field a lot, is that prevention is the best intervention. Prevention is the best intervention, and that is most important and most true when it comes to things like mental health and addiction struggles. What I'm getting at here is that there are a variety of things exterior to someone's life that are affecting their health outcomes. Okay. This is a public health concept called the social determinants of health. Some of you might be familiar with this already. All right, there's usually like 5 primary categories: education, access, and quality; healthcare and quality; neighborhood and built environment; social community context; and economic stability. You see, I circle economic stability there because I think it's one of the most important. Because frankly, if I am not able to make enough income, I'm not necessarily going to be able to live in the best neighborhood. I'm not necessarily going to be able to afford things like health insurance. I'm probably not going to have the best amount of choice when it comes to like which schools I might go to, or kids or schools I might have to send my kids to, etc. Economic stability kind of influences those other 4 as well. But the point of the matter is, like, if something goes wrong in any of these 5 categories, or if there are inequities or disparities that exist in any of these 5 categories, it's going to directly affect someone's health behaviors and health outcomes, right? If I don't have a healthy place to live, I'm going to be more susceptible to different diseases and stressors that come from having an unhealthy place to live. Or if I don't feel safe where I live, right? If I'm really isolated, maybe I'm a senior and my family lives in a different community, and my particular old folks home is not that great at planning activities, and I just kind of sit in my room all day, right? That's going to have negative mental health outcomes, and that's not necessarily all my fault, right? That is something that's happening to us. Those things do play a role in determining what happens with your health. So, like, what do we do about that, right? We have to move upstream. Okay, many of the roles that we play and the roles that we've been given to play are downstream roles, right? So if there are any counselors in the room or mentors or things like that, these are downstream roles, and they're really important, right? They're really, really important for especially trying to solve some of the problems that already exist, the things that have already presented themselves as symptoms or as hardships that our clients are experiencing. But in order to really make an impact societally, we have to think about the systems that are impacting the people that we're serving, and think about how we can change those pieces of our community. Of course, that includes things like advocacy and how you vote and the conditions that people are living in, etc. those are oftentimes coming downstream and influencing why someone is drinking too much or why someone is experiencing higher rates of depression, anxiety, etc. Okay? So don't hear me wrong. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of downstream and midstream impact, because there's still impact. There's still positive things that we can do. But we need to be more aware and more intentional about our upstream role that we can play too. So let's talk about trauma and stress. Okay, when things go wrong in those social determinants of health, what does it look like? And what are some examples that our students and our clients might be experiencing? Okay, this list that I'm about to put in front of you comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study that was completed in the 90s by Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Excuse me. And essentially what they did was they surveyed several thousand adults, and most of these adults were sort of average middle class adults. They asked them about all of these areas of their lives as kids, right? Like, where did you grow up? What kind of house did you live in? Estimate your parents' income. Tell us about, the social experiences or the ups and the downs, etc. And then they did a follow-up survey about what health outcomes you're experiencing right now. And they found some correlated links between these types of trauma and stressors and negative health outcomes, like higher rates of heart disease, higher incidence rates of cancer, and of course, negative mental health impact. So divorce or other family conflicts, instability or insecurity. This could be financial, economic, environmental, food, etc. Changing schools or jobs. Oftentimes this includes like workload or work-life balance stress, or it could include a changing of friend group or a changing of community, having to kind of restart that social context. Being abused would be the obvious one, sexually, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Experiencing any sort of grief or loss, which nearly 2 million of us experienced in the past year due to the pandemic. Experiencing bullying of any kind causes an immense amount of interpersonal and relational stress. Having a parent or caregiver or partner or really any other family member who suffers from substance use disorder or a mental illness in the home. Having a family member involved with incarceration or doing any sort of criminal activity. Violent incidents of any kind. This could be a car wreck or your house floods or a fire, something like that, anything like that. And then, of course, experiencing racism or discrimination of any kind. All of these, when experienced as a kiddo, especially, are correlated to negative health outcomes as an adult, right? And what they found was, based on your ACE score, that's what they called it, like how many of these you could tick off in your own life, sort of was predictory or predicated. Well, I don't know what the right word is. It could predict sort of what you could face as an adult if you didn't have any intervention in sort of young adulthood or mid-childhood. Right? So if there's no intervention, some of these experiences could predict negative health outcomes as an adult. But it wasn't a curse, right? So adverse childhood experiences are not a curse that we can't grow out of, if you will, right? There's this thing called resilience and neuroplasticity in our brain. And when there is positive intervention, upstream prevention, and positive interactions with caring, supportive adults in our life, when we get that kind of support, we can build resilience against some of those negative health outcomes, despite what we may have experienced as kiddos. But let's say we are experiencing this, or our kids are experiencing this, or the students we serve are experiencing some of these things. It puts their brain into what's called fight, flight, or freeze response, or survival mode, okay? Fight, flight, or freeze response. It's like that feeling when your muscles tense up and your heart rate increases and your breathing gets really shallow. Right? Some of us try to escape those dangerous situations, and so maybe that's a physical escape, like actually leaving that situation altogether, or that could be internal escape, kind of dissociating from the problem that's occurring outside of me, just turning inside. Kiddos are especially prone to the deer in the headlights response, the freeze response. Like, if I just don't respond at all to this trauma, maybe it'll go away, right? Which is pretty characteristic of those that don't have the physical ability or the sort of the power ability. They've not been empowered as a kid in our society to be able to speak up for themselves in some of those situations. So the brain is like spaghetti noodles, okay? And all those noodles are neurological pathways. Some of them are electric, some of them are chemical. All right, and those neurological pathways are sending messages and firing neurons in different directions to produce different responses to your reality, right? To whatever you're experiencing in everyday life. Okay. And when we are experiencing the fight, flight, or freeze response, this sort of interior area of our brain, it's called the amygdala and the hippocampus, triggers the release of stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. Okay. And those stress hormones are really, really powerful in a physiological way, but they don't always get used up right away when you're feeling stressed out, right? So like there has to be some sort of coping strategy to help reduce those levels of cortisol and adrenaline. So if you don't have the support you need or the resources you need, or if you don't have good coping strategies, that cortisol or adrenaline just kind of gets built up. In addition to this, our dopamine levels, which is like the pleasure hormone, the motivation hormone, that gets severely decreased when we're feeling stressed out, right? So you go into a deficit of dopamine, meaning you need more of it in order to function normally, okay? Not just get high or feel good, but just to function normally, all right? And there are some other things that happen to the brain when you're feeling stressed out. One of the first things that happens is the attention, planning, and decision-making center, the prefrontal cortex, starts to get turned down. The volume gets turned down. It gets harder to make decisions and harder to communicate. Movement, touch, some of those sensory things also start to get a little bit overwhelmed. And so that area of the brain starts turning down. The area of the brain responsible for communication becomes slower and murkier. It's harder to express how I feel when I'm feeling stressed out. Right? That's why sometimes we see more just aggressive emotion when it comes to students who are feeling stressed, just anger, yelling, anything I can do to try and make a point that I'm not okay, right? Or sometimes it goes in the opposite direction, just total shutdown, totally avoiding all communication whatsoever, right? That's what's happening in the brain here. And again, like I mentioned, adrenaline and cortisol goes up. That's that fight, flight, or freeze response, and dopamine goes down. But if it builds up over time, let's say it's something like racism or discrimination that your student is experiencing based off of a component of their identity, that buildup becomes toxic, right? Your brain ultimately with the fight, flight, or freeze response is trying to protect itself. It's trying to protect you and get you out of danger. It's trying to help that student get away from whatever difficult experience they have going on in their life. But when there is no way out, right, it becomes overactive and toxic to the body. We get way too much adrenaline and cortisol. It's built up and never used. And that it has a long-term physiological memory attached to that trauma. This creates things like triggers, and triggers can be anything. It could be the sound of a car starting if you were in a car accident. It could be the smell of someone's perfume or cologne if they abused you. It could be just any sort of elevated emotion in a room. If you feel tension in the room, that can be really triggering for some people. It could be a location. Like I have a friend who experienced some workplace abuse, and they still get really tense when they drive past the exit on 65 South that they would get off to go to that workplace, right? That's a trigger. Ultimately, that toxicity can lead to other physical and mental health processes, like leading to different problems like poor coping skill development, symptoms of depression, anxiety, higher rates of heart disease and cancers, etc. So let's talk about some of those coping strategies, okay? I want to try and get practical with you for the last few minutes, talk about what can we actually do to help students make some progress, build some resilience, and what can we help ourselves do? And furthermore, what should we try to avoid? And what should we try and help our clients and our students avoid as well? So some good healthy coping skills that are easy wins, and typically they're free, would be journaling. Journaling has shown through research to really produce healthier hormone balances in the brain when you participate in it habitually, regularly. Getting some of those thoughts and feelings into word and on paper and out of your head, it can be a really, really good tool. Talking it out with trusted people. Of course, this would be like counseling or therapy, but it doesn't always have to be, right? And a student might not be ready for that quite yet. They might not be ready to take that step. So this could be just talking it out with you or with their parent if they're close to their parent or caregiver. It could be a coach or a teacher or an administrator, a principal. It could be a scoutmaster or a pastor or whomever, right? Anyone that they trust, that they know loves them for who they are. Talking it out with them is a great coping skill, and it's something we need to try and reduce the stigma around, right? There's no weakness associated with talking to someone about your problems. Exercise is great. For any sort of physical activity, something as simple as just going for a 20-minute walk can help release more dopamine, as well as other great hormones for you, like endorphins and oxytocin as well. And that can help counterbalance some of that cortisol and adrenaline buildup. Creative outlets or hobbies, anything artistic, music, sports, cooking, baking, gardening, like anything you can do with your hands and your mind to engage it in something different than just those stressful thoughts or memories or symptoms that someone might be experiencing. Breathing exercises are huge. As we already looked at the brain, the area of the brain that is most immediately affected by stress is the area responsible for breathing and heart rate, right? So if we can focus our minds on slowing our breath down to a more even tempo and noticing the sensations of what it feels like to breathe, that has shown a lot of really strong scientific evidence of helping counterbalance some of those negative feelings. Meditation is a great option as well, mindfulness activities, etc. And so all of these are great tools that we can help equip our students with and that we can start putting into practice for ourselves from a self-care perspective. Things to avoid, all right, some unhealthy coping skills. And if we're being honest with ourselves, the one that we sometimes have a tendency to gravitate towards, be like binge eating. I don't know about you, but when I'm feeling particularly freaked out, I can power my way through a sleeve of Oreos in no time, right? In one sitting. And that's not a good coping strategy. That can lead to other health problems, right? Could be not eating at all, right? And sometimes this has to do with a mechanism of control that our brain is trying to establish, right? I can't control what's happening out here, but I can control what goes into me, right? So restricting that can be a really unhealthy coping skill. Bottling it up. A lot of folks are great at that. Some of us are professionals at just pretending like everything's fine and not talking about it to anybody anywhere. Mind numbing with media, spending 8 hours on Netflix or Hulu with content that should take you 8 weeks, right? Isolation, just locking ourselves in our apartments and not talking to anybody, never unlocking the door for mom or dad if it's a student or home or whatever. That is an unhealthy coping skill. Ultimately, it does more harm than good. And of course, substance use, like we already mentioned, which includes drinking, smoking, vaping, pills, and more. Now, ultimately, unhealthy coping skills are going to do more harm than good. When it comes to substance use in the brain, we got to talk a little bit about what's happening here. Okay, all substances, both legal and illegal, trigger a release of the neurotransmitter chemical dopamine in the brain, which causes a sensation of pleasure and motivation. That feels good, let's do it again. That feels good, let's do it again. Okay, but when you're using a substance, you are manufacturing that neurotransmitter release. And so you're not getting a normal amount, you're getting like a flood of dopamine. It is way too much for your system, especially for a young developing brain. It's just not prepared to handle that, right? And so it creates a really, really giant reaction in the body and in the brain. Initially, that's a reaction of what feels like euphoria, but that fades super quickly. We'll talk about that here. In what's called the addiction cycle in the brain, right, the brain and the body starts to build tolerance after that first misuse. Okay, tolerance means I need more of a substance in order to trigger the same amount of dopamine release and the same feelings of pleasure or balancing. Ultimately, a person can become dependent upon that substance for daily life. Now, here's where understanding this is really critical, okay? After a certain period of time of tolerant use, when you become dependent, you're no longer just using to get high and experience pleasure. You're using to stave off withdrawal symptoms, all right? You're trying not to feel sick, all right? That's a difference, and that's important for us to realize. Ultimately, the brain starts to believe that that substance is required for the survival of the organism, okay? In other words, if I don't have a drink, I'm going to get sick or I might die. If I don't have a pill at these times during the day or in this quantity or in this way, right, I could get sick or I could die, right? So this lie starts building up in the brain because of the physiological responses associated with it and whatever mental health struggles might be part of this as well. This leads to things like symptomatic behaviors, hardships, heartaches, etc. Some of the things that we mentioned earlier that are signs of substance use, right? They have a lot of negative social impact, right? But it's not because someone who's using substances is a bad person or a bad kid. They're not just a bad apple, right? That's not the case, right? Those are symptomatic behaviors. They're making some of these choices and performing some of these actions in order to keep the organism functioning and stave off that sickness and that illness, right? So yeah, that sometimes includes lying and angry words and violence and things that are really negative socially. But it's not because they're just bad people, right? We have to get away from that kind of talk. Ultimately, the area of the brain that is responsible for the addiction cycle is the same area of the brain responsible for the stress cycle and the trauma response, okay? the area responsible for emotion, heart rate, breathing, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. When you get that hit of a substance, dopamine is released way too much in way too big of a dose. Doesn't help that we have kind of a culture of substance use in the US, right? Especially for our students, this can become really problematic. There's a certain glorification of substance use, which includes sort of a downplaying of some of the negative symptoms and behaviors in popular music, media, movies, TV, etc. There is a sort of reputational thing that's happening here as well. There's, of course, the tiers of social acceptability, like we were referring to soft and hard substances earlier, but here's the thing, the brain doesn't care what substance you give it. If it's addictive, it'll become addicted. Oftentimes, young people can end up in codependent or co-using relationships where the only thing holding these two people together is using together. Right? Getting help is often associated with weakness. That's just stigma at work. And of course, these societal demands and stress on, it says workforce, but student force as well, right? You gotta get straight A's, be successful, hide your pain, push through it, grit your teeth and bear it, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like that is a culture of stress and of substance use. Right? That's not helping anybody. It's creating unrealistic expectations that nobody can manage. So some data for you data nerds in the room, okay, just to prove to you that it is happening with our students. This is from the 2021 Youth Risk Behavior Survey. I divided it into mental health and then substance use on the next slide here. So for high school students in the state of Indiana, grades 9 through 12, 30% report that their mental health was most of the time or always not good, including stress, anxiety, or depression. So just under a third of students feel that way at some point during the year. 46.7% reported feeling sad or hopeless almost every day for up to as long as 2 weeks in a row, sometimes leading to them to stop doing usual activities. 27.7% reported seriously attempting suicide, 22% having made a plan to attempt, and just under 12% actually attempting suicide during the past year. In nearly all of those data categories, students of color and queer students experienced higher rates, which says something about the role of discrimination and racism, et cetera, as a trauma in someone's life. When it comes to substance use in the same grade levels, just under 20% currently smoke or vape, like regularly, like habitually. Around 20% currently drink alcohol. About 15% currently use cannabis in any form. 17% have used a pill that's not prescribed to them by a doctor or differently than prescribed. Again, in nearly all of those data categories, students of color and queer students experience higher rates. But I actually find some of this data a little bit encouraging because the other part of the data, the other part of the pie graph, if you will, that we're not seeing is that 80 to 85% of Indiana students are not using. Right, so the quote unquote social norm, the thing most people are doing is finding other coping strategies that aren't as negative as substance use and don't have as negative outcomes. And that gives me hope, right? That's a number we can work with. Not everybody gets the help they need when they need it, right? There is help available. Not everybody's getting it, right? There is a cost associated with getting help. Indiana has been declared as a national healthcare provider shortage area in the United States. So there's not enough providers to provide the help we need. And of course, there's this like social stigma that exists around mental health and addiction. Now, we can't do much about cost, right? Treatment's never gonna be free. Can't do a lot about provider access limitations except for advocating for better insurance coverage and things like that. But one thing we can do for to really create some meaningful changes is address stigma. So let's dive into that for just a moment. And stigma I define as a set of negative, often misinformed attitudes and beliefs that motivate a person to be afraid of or discriminate against other people. The key word there is misinformed. Okay, it's something. It's learned attitude. It's learned beliefs. Right, things that we have been taught growing up, things that we have learned from media and stories and things that have happened in our families, etc. But keyword is misinformed. Right, and ultimately that leads to us perpetuating stigma in the relationships around us. And that stigma shows up in usually three primary ways. In the words we use, which can sometimes be explosive. You know, we use words like addict, alcoholic, junkie, pothead, lunatic, maniac, crazy person, stuff like that, right? Like it's just really stigmatizing words that can be hurtful and isolating people. Stigma shows up in like the body language that we use, right? Like think about maybe the last time you were in Chicago, right? Odds are you probably had the opportunity to interact with somebody who has no home, who's currently unhoused. And statistically, over 75% of unhoused individuals are also experiencing symptoms of mental illness due to that trauma. And so Maybe they were talking to themselves, or maybe they were yelling something at you. And if we're being honest with ourselves, how many of us like looked those folks in the eyes and said, "Hey, are you all right? You need some food, or can I help you in any way?" Right? Like most of us walked to the other side of the sidewalk, right? Or just like didn't make eye contact and tried to keep our head up, right? You think they don't know that? You think they don't notice? Right? That is stigma showing up in our body language. Right, and stigma shows up in the media we consume. I don't know if there's any fans of the show Breaking Bad. It's a brilliant show, great story writing, great dialogue, etc. But it's one of the most stigmatizing representations of addiction that's ever been made, visually speaking. It's just not accurate, right? Obviously, it's trying to depict the horror of it, and there are horrific elements, but there's no hope in that show, and that's not how real life is. There is hope in real life. There are 25 million people in the United States who are in long-term recovery who have proved that there is hope. Ultimately, that stigma is the largest barrier to people getting the treatment care they need when they need it. So how do you help? All right, let's land the plane here. It starts with empathy, okay? Empathy is only good if it's put into action. All right, so it's not just sympathy where we try to imagine how somebody feels. Empathy is more compassionate. Empathy requires us to take a step in that person's shoes and feel with them, right? And try and provide something to help meet the need, or try and address the system that is part of creating that need, right? That empathy is the best place to start. And that starts right here in our hearts and in our heads. And that's the best thing we can all do, right? But ultimately, there's some other things we can do too, right? Especially when it comes to young people. This is a quote from the ACEs study that I mentioned earlier. We know that resilience requires a child can rely on the presence of at least one supportive, caring adult. Maybe that one supportive, caring adult is you. Right? And all it takes is one, just one supportive, caring adult that helps a kid feel safe and connected, can help that kid build the resilience they need to outlive their trauma, right? To outgrow their trauma and their pain, and to have positive health outcomes and develop positive coping strategies for stress. So let's talk about how to do that, okay? These are like the last 4 or 5 slides here. I know it's 12 or 11:45. I got about 5 minutes left here, but I'm going to try and breeze through these real quick so you have some practical tools and some things that you can discuss in more depth in the breakout sessions. So try to create opportunities for safety and connection for your kid. All right, this includes offering open spaces, both physically and emotionally, right? So not cornering a kid in their room to talk to them, right? Not putting a kid in an isolated space, right? Not forcing them into a conversation, right? All of those are closed spaces. We need to offer open spaces. Offer different ways for kids to communicate their needs other than just verbalizing them. You can get creative. Remember, the part of the brain that's responsible for verbal communication gets kind of murky and turned down during stress. So maybe it would help for that kid to write down how they feel. Maybe it would help that kid to act out how they feel. Maybe it would help to draw it or paint it, right? Offer creative ways to verbalize that. Give ample time to respond, right? Sometimes they're going to need a few minutes to gather themselves when something bad has happened. They might need a few days to gather themselves when something bad has happened. Use trauma-sensitive language. I'll give you examples of that in a little bit. Allow them time to take a break when needed, especially if you feel yourself getting animated and heated, right? Take 5. Let's go our separate ways. Think about this and then regroup here in a minute. Be aware of your own body language, vocal tone, facial reactions. This does not communicate that I love you and I want you to talk to me, right? This does not communicate that you're free to feel the way you feel, right? So be aware of things like that and how you're coming off, what it's like to be on the receiving end of you. Hold space for your kids' thoughts, fears, beliefs. They might not always make sense to you. You might disagree with them deliberately, but hold space for them. Let them exist. Talk about risks versus rewards. This usually works a lot better than ultimatums and absolutes, right? Be aware of your own trauma history and how it affects your reactions to things. I can't tell you how many times, even with my my little 2-year-old daughter, that I find myself getting angry at something she's saying or doing, right? Because it reminds me of how I react to things. So be aware of that, right? Be aware of your own triggers. Offer your kids choices, either this or that. Either we can talk this way, or we can wait a few minutes and talk this way. Either you can tell me exactly what happened right now if you feel comfortable doing that, or you can write down what happened and drop that letter off on the kitchen table when you're ready, right? Providing some agency and autonomy can be really helpful to regain that sense of control and balance that a kid's brain needs. Respect kids' boundaries. If they don't want to talk to you, there might be a reason. All right, it might be a good reason. right? Maybe they have another confidant or another trusted adult that they can talk to, and you can connect with that adult, right? Once that conversation's been had, and that's an okay option as well. Offer your support, of course. I'm here for you. I'm here to help. I'm here to listen. I might not have all the answers, but I'm here. Get on their level instead of towering over them. This is again like kind of a body language thing. Like sit down next to a kid. That's a better way to talk than them sitting and you standing. Do your best to model respect and empathy. Right, the golden rule: treat others how you want to be treated applies to caregiving and applies to teaching and applies to counseling and mentoring and any other youth-based organizational role. Here are some examples of traumatizing language on the left-hand side and connective language or trauma-sensitive language on the right-hand side. Take a look at those for just a minute. We've probably used some of the ones on the left when we've gotten mad or upset or frustrated, right? I encourage you to try to practice some of the phrases on the right because it preserves the dignity and just the kidness of the kid you're working with, right? Don't go the re-traumatizing route, even though sometimes it's easy. I think one particularly sneaky one is the very last one is that, well, when I was a kid, I just this or that when I felt that way. Here's the thing. When you were just a kid, you weren't globally connected in the way our kids are now. When you were just a kid, you didn't have access to the world's information, mostly in a negative way, that our kids do, right? When you were just a kid, mental health was still a really taboo thing, right? And now we have the freedom to talk about it a little more specifically, right? So you might not have the right answer from your own childhood. Instead, say something like, I can empathize with you in this. One risk versus reward topic, especially when it comes to substance use, it's important for us to be aware of that most kids are not using at school or in public. Most use at home or in someone else's home when it comes to a drug or alcohol, right? So it's important to encourage kids not to isolate. And despite what media depictions of substance use might lead you to believe, like they very well are doing it behind a closed door, right? Alone when they're not feeling okay, right? And that isolation, that using alone is what puts kids in really dangerous situations that could lead to a drug poisoning, death, or an overdose. If you have a student that is experiencing an overdose situation or a drug poisoning incident, these are some of the most common signs. Okay, usually it includes going unconscious, slowing of the heart rate, and slowing breathing are the main things you want to pay attention to. If it's opioid related, you can help that person if you carry Narcan or naloxone, which you see an example of there. A single dose of that up the nose can bring them out of that drug poisoning or that overdose situation and help them regain consciousness. But it's really important just to call 911. That's more important than anything else, right? Because every first responder in the state of Indiana carries Narcan now, and they can help that person or that student and save their life. If you're not sure where to get Narcan for free, go to overdoselifeline.org. They've got a map that shows you a whole bunch of areas up near Portage where you can get free naloxone. Some of those are like vending machines. Some of them are like Nalox boxes, or just like a plastic box labeled very clearly where you can just go and get a dose and keep that in your briefcase or your bag or purse or whatever. Keep some in your offices as well. So to conclude, remember that treatment works and recovery is possible, right? One-on-one psychotherapy and counseling is a great tool. It works, and healing is possible with those tools. Group psychotherapy and counseling, the same applies. It works. It works well. Peer recovery support, working with someone who has lived experience with that struggle, whether that's individually or in a group setting, it works, right? It works. Medication-assisted treatment, especially when it's used as prescribed and under the supervision of a doctor, it can really, really help, especially in the early stages of healing from symptoms of mental illness and trying to get into long-term recovery from substance use. Inpatient care, especially for more severe cases or severe symptoms, whether that's short-term for a few days or that's long-term for like 28 days or several months, right? That sort of stability and structured supportive living environment can be really, really helpful. It works for people. All right, hope is possible. The professional resources you all should be aware of. The Indiana Youth Institute's Kids Count data book is great. They produce that every year and update the data as best they can so that we can have sort of a pulse on what's happening with Indiana kids from a health behavior standpoint. Mental health first aid training is great. Question, persuade, refer, which is suicide prevention training, is great. A few different TED Talks that I'll be sure to leave on the slides for you, and I'll send that so that you guys can have a copy of it and just click those links and save them and watch them later. This is Normal is an awesome podcast. It's actually produced by young people for young people sharing their stories. Mental Illness Happy Hour is another inspirational podcast. Busy Living Sober is a great long-term recovery podcast with practical tools. I should say the Willow Center also has a podcast that I host, so you're welcome to look that up as well. Final reminders: resilience, recovery are possible. So there's always hope. Right? There's always hope. Right? Despite the fact that some of the stuff we're talking about today is heavy and hard to address, there is hope for change and hope for improvement and betterment. Remember that prevention is the best intervention. Try to think upstream about what we can do to serve our students and serve ourselves. Change must start on a person's own terms, right? There has to be autonomy when it comes to wellness journeys and recovery journeys. And remember that the opposite of trauma, the opposite of addiction, the opposite of mental illness is safety and connection. Safety and connection are the things that we need to provide to our students and build resilience. You might not be able to fix everything all at once. If you can, give me a call. I'd love to chat, but you're a human too. So until that point, when we're just fixing things one at a time, just pick one to improve. All right, start there, try to do it well. And when you're ready and confident, go ahead and move on to the next thing. All right, just pick one place to start. I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chase, for that presentation. A lot of great resources that you provided, a lot of great ways that we can be empathetic during a time of mental health and crisis for youth that we serve. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and give you guys a couple minute break just to debrief and to use the bathroom, grab something to drink, maybe something to eat. And by the time you come back, you're going to be assigned to a breakout group. I've got some questions that I will upload to you in your groups, and then we'll reconvene together as a group. So enjoy your few moment break. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that you've enjoyed your breakout groups and had an opportunity to discuss some of the questions and some of the content that was shared today. So at this point, we're just going to start wrapping up for the day and opening up for any questions that you might have or any comments that you'd like to share regarding the presentation today.
I can go, I like to go. I think that as with other things that we've talked about at the tables and as was touched on, we were going through the presentation, it's really important to understand like where we are as humans so that we can better assist the children and our youth in our lives. Because if we can address those triggers or like, why do I react that way when you say that thing? It's a big deal so like dealing with our own stuff first is really important. But in my breakout room, it was another foster parent. So as a foster parent, it's always like we feel like we don't have enough resources and like assistance to help these youth that are really struggling and already traumatized, and we're new to them, and how do we better help them? Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is just talking to each other when we're in similar situations to get like what works, what doesn't work. Support groups are really good. But the schools are kind of blockers for a lot of things. So I teach tobacco education and prevention, and the schools like block me a lot from coming in, and I don't understand why. Like I'm free, I'm here and trying to assist, and I feel like they really kind of put that barrier up with me a lot, even the schools I went to in my community, they're like, I don't know. I'm like, give me 20 minutes. Like, I just want 20 minutes. Let me just touch on it and maybe get their like brain thinking about it. But I think the other question was, what do we need mentally for ourselves? I just need time where I'm not responsible for anyone else. So a foster parent, I get like pulled in a million directions. My job, I get pulled in a million directions, and I'm always trying to help people and help youth. But I need like 45 minutes to myself every day. Like completely, no one talked to me. No one touched me. I'm my own human. So I think that's important to like figure out what we need and give that to ourselves so that we can kind of reset and then come back to help. Because that's what we all want to do anyway, is help, but like you can't pour from an empty cup. So
that's huge. That's so
Snaps for
important.
you, Emily. Awesome. Anybody else want to share or weigh in? Anybody want to represent maybe your breakout group, some of the takeaways that you might have had shared in those groups?
So in my breakout group, one of the things that we all kind of agreed on for something that stood out to us during the training was the trauma sensitive language exercise and how important it is to use more of the trauma sensitive language rather than more of the re-traumatizing language that was shown on the screen. I thought that was really interesting and important for not only youth workers, but for everyone, because I feel like we could all benefit from using that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Natalie, for sharing. Thanks, Emily, for sharing. You both hit some great topics. You know, I've learned, Emily, that self-care is not selfish, it's sacred. And I think sometimes and too often we give ourselves away and we burn the candle way down, and we ourselves then begin to face some mental health challenges in that burnout. So it was really good that you brought that out. And Natalie, the language is so important. Words are so powerful. And if we're not careful, our words can really create some more trauma than actually help. So those are both very, very good points that were brought out there. So
Do you mind
anybody
if
else
I
want
add
to
one more
share?
thing? Do you mind if I add
Yeah.
one more thing? Something I want to share that I learned in a fostering class that I think really helped with a lot of this when we had a very traumatized 6-year-old. It's good for anybody, even adults, is when if someone is like totally freaking out, having a meltdown, instead of giving them a timeout or like telling your friend maybe you need a timeout, have a time in with them where you let them freak out and throw a tantrum and do whatever they want to do, and you literally just sit with them. I'm here when you need me. I'm here when you want help. But I'm not here to like punish you. I'm not here to tell you your feelings aren't valid. I'm not here to tell you your feelings are too big or too much. Feel the feelings and then we can chat about them. And I think that's something that really changed my perspective on like punitive measures when it came to kids that are acting out or adults that are acting out, is like they're asking for help. They're not saying that like I'm not doing something I shouldn't be doing. And it like changes my perspective. Even like, this sounds terrible, but like a Karen in a grocery store is having a meltdown and you're like, what do you need? Like what needs are not being met that you're having this moment right now? I can stand here with you. This is not productive. We could do something else though, but it's like anybody in the world that you see is doing that. It's like they need something. Something is not happening for them. So it kind of changed my perspective on like everything for that.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So Chase put in the chat that he'll share the PowerPoint as well as a resource, so we can get that to you guys as well. And of course, we'll have this recording available on our website as well for a future resource. Anybody have any questions for Chase, or anybody have any closing comments? Okay. Well, Chase, again, we want to say thank you so much for being here with us today and just shedding some light on this subject that has just become so important and a part of our everyday work that we do in the lives of the students that we serve. So I want to thank you for all your hard work and your efforts that you do. And I want to thank everyone today for just carving some time out and just getting refueled, refreshed, renewed, putting some new fresh things in your pockets to help those that you're serving as well. So without further ado, just want to say thanks for hopping on and joining us today. We appreciate everyone's feedback and the opportunity just to see each other and plug in this way. So without any further ado, have a great day, everyone, and we will chat soon. All right. Take care.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.